Tanzler was born on February the 8th, 1877, in Dresden, Germany. Mystery surrounds his earlier life, but after graduating from medical university, he left for Australia, where during World War I, he ended up in an internment camp. After the war, former prisoners were not allowed to stay in the country. Karl was deported to Holland, but here he saw no future prospects in post-war Europe. Instead, he decided to emigrate to the United States, where his sister already lived in Florida. In 1920, when Karl was approximately 43 years old, he met a woman called Doris Anna Schaefer, who would become his wife the following year. The couple went on to have 2 children, Aisha Tanzler, born in 1922, and Clarissa Tanzler, who was born 2 years afterwards, in 1924. Sadly, Clarissa later died at the age of just 10 years old from diphtheria, a bacterial infection in the throat. Unfortunately, it wasn't uncommon for people, especially children, to die young back in those times. Karl was already known to be a strange character. Despite him seeming to be a normal family man, Karl was certainly a little eccentric. Something that would add to his strangeness was a story he would tell people. He swore that twice during his life, the first time being in childhood, and later in his early adult years whilst travelling through Italy, he claimed that one of his dead ancestors, Countess Anna Constantia von Cosel, had visited him and revealed the same vision to him on 2 occasions. Karl said that in these visions, his ancestor had revealed to him a face of his one true love, which certainly was not the face of his wife. The face that this ghostly figure would reveal to him was an exotic-looking woman with a youthful, pretty face, dark features and dark hair. In 1926, Karl moved to Havana in Cuba. He went alone, but was later joined by his wife and 2 young daughters, shortly before Clarissa passed away. The family didn't stay together very long, as just under a year later, Karl took a job as a radiology technician at the US Marine Hospital in Key West, Florida, under the name Karl Tanzler von Cosel, named after the lady who had appeared to him in his visions. However, this time, he left his family, choosing to abandon them for good. This was said to be very typical of Karl. He apparently had a very narcissistic personality and a high opinion of himself. He thought nothing of abandoning his family, as he seen them as dead weight, which is ironic for this case. In April of 1930, Karl was working his job at the hospital. By this time, he had been there a couple of years. One morning, a frantic lady had walked through the door. She had brought in her daughter, who was becoming increasingly sick. It was this patient that made something switch in Karl's brain, and this switch would lead to a very dark and morbid infatuation. The patient was 22-year-old local beauty, Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, otherwise known as Elena. Elena was a Cuban-American and was a very sought-after lady. She was beautiful, with a pretty face, well-styled dark hair, and she dressed nicely. Immediately, Karl recognised her as the lady that had been shown to him in his visions. In fact, she resembled his childhood premonition so closely that he immediately became convinced that their love was meant to be. Elena had been a married woman despite her young age. Her husband had been Louis Messer, but when Elena had suffered a miscarriage just a few short years earlier, her husband had left her behind and moved to Miami. Elena had been brought into the Marina Hospital by her mother for some examinations. She had been showing signs of illness for a while and was just at the hospital to see if there was any treatment that she could be given. Eventually, Elena was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a deadly disease at that time with little to no cure, and a very high death rate. The disease had in fact already taken the life of her sister, and would eventually lead to the deaths of more of her immediate family members. Karl Tanzler did everything humanely possible to treat and find a cure for Elena's illness, but despite the lack of qualifications needed to treat a tuberculosis patient, Karl was determined to save Elena. and used a variety of specially made tonics, elixirs and medicines in an effort to do so. Carl was besotted and developing a very unhealthy obsession, so much so that he would shower his patient with gifts of clothing and jewellery, and even went on to profess his love to her. Bearing in mind that Eleanor was a beautiful 21-year-old woman who had men falling at her feet everywhere she went, and Carl Tanzler was a creepy older man from the hospital who definitely looked his age and more. Eleanor did not reciprocate any of Carl's affections. She was merely hoping that he would be able to cure her, but it was said that she didn't have any romantic feelings towards this man. Carl continued effortlessly to treat Eleanor, but sadly, on October the 25th, 1931, Eleanor passed away. Carl was inconsolable. He insisted on paying for the funeral and even talked her relatives into allowing him to have a crypt built with his own money. Eleanor's family agreed, but they didn't anticipate that for some strange reason, Carl only had one key made, and this was kept strictly in his possession. For 2 years, Carl visited his love every day, but in 1933, when he was fired from the hospital, his visits abruptly stopped. This sudden change surprised Eleanor's relatives. Little did they know that one dark night in 1933, Carl had done something unthinkable. In the dead of night, he had crept to the mausoleum, removed Eleanor's body, and wheeled her remains home on a toy wagon. He said in his later years that Eleanor's spirit would come to him when he sat with her singing her favourite lullaby, and one day she had asked him to take her from her grave. Here's where things get surprisingly weirder. One thing that is to be known about dead bodies is that they decay, but Carl was absolutely not going to let this happen. He had found his dream woman, and he'd be damned if he let her skin fall off and her eyeballs rot away. With much passion, Carl began to try and preserve his lady as best he could. He firstly attached her bones together with piano wire to make sure that she didn't begin to fall apart when he handled her. He inserted glass eyes to give her a more lifeless appearance, and as her skin began to drop away, he would replace it with silk cloths, wrapped in wax and plaster. This eventually gave her a very mannequin-like appearance. As her hair began to drop away from her scalp, Carl fashioned a wig from hair that previously belonged to Eleanor, that her mother had gifted to him. As Eleanor's body began to cave in on itself, Carl decided how best to combat this issue than to fill her chest cavity with rags to maintain her shape. Carl would always have Eleanor looking her best. He would dress her up in stockings, gloves, and fine jewellery. When he wasn't wooing his dead love, she was laying in his bed, where he would sleep beside her at night. Obviously, being that this was a dead body in his home, there was a pungent odour. In an attempt to mask the smell coming from Eleanor's body, Carl used perfumes, disinfectants, and preserving agents to mask the smell. Carl lived with Eleanor's body for around 7 years, when in October of 1940, the entire town began talking about the reclusive man, often seen buying women's clothing and perfume, on top of one local boy's account of witnessing the doctor dancing with what appeared to be a giant doll. Eleanor's family began to suspect that something was off. One evening, Eleanor's sister, Florinda, went over to Carl's home to confront him over the rumours when she caught sight of him through the window, dancing with the corpse. As imagined, Florinda was horrified. She immediately called the police, and they came to arrest Carl for grave robbery. During his trial, Carl Tanzler had revealed that he had been building a spaceship in which he could take Eleanor's body to outer space, where the radiation would jolt her back to life. On the screen now is the groundbreaking contraption. Carl was sent to undergo various psychiatric examinations to see if he was mentally competent for trial on the charge of maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. A preliminary hearing took place on October the 9th, 1940, at Monroe County Courthouse. However, the trial was soon dropped, and Carl had to be released because the statute of limitations had already expired. Upon examination of Eleanor's body, more grisly details came to light. Perhaps worst of all is that when Eleanor was examined by two separate physicians during an autopsy, they both reported that there were signs that necrophilia had taken place. These details didn't surface until 1972, but they each recalled that a tube had been inserted inside Eleanor's genitals with the intentions to allow intercourse. Carl had more than likely been having sexual intercourse with the corpse. Carl was now a free man, despite all the depraved things that he had done to Eleanor after she died. Eleanor's body, now out of the hands of Carl, was put on display at the Dean Lopez funeral home. This was a grisly but quite common practice in the olden days, to display dead bodies in an attempt to boost business to a place of work, such as in a funeral home. In total, around 6,800 people came from all over the country to view Eleanor's corpse for themselves, where they got to gaze upon her defiled body for $1. Eventually, upon her family's request, she was turned over to Key West Cemetery and buried in an unmarked grave to prevent further tampering and keep her out of the clutches of Carl. Surprisingly, instead of horrified reactions and outrage, the general reaction from the public was mostly sympathetic towards Carl, and instead of seeing him as a creepy, disturbed man who committed depraved acts with the corpse of his patient, they thought of him as an eccentric romantic. Eleanor, however, had not been his wife or girlfriend. This was merely a patient that held no romantic feelings towards him whatsoever. Dead or alive, this had all been committed against her will. In 1944, Carl moved to Pasco County, Florida. He settled here and had intentions of writing an autobiography. He also later rekindled his romance with his former wife Doris, who provided support to him throughout the entire ordeal, perhaps hoping that they could now move on. His true love, however, was not Doris, and he still held a burning obsession for Eleanor. Nothing was going to change that. To cope with being separated from Eleanor, he had a death mask made of her and created a life-sized effigy of Eleanor's body to replicate her stature. He lived with this effigy until his death on July 3rd, 1952, at the age of 75. His body was discovered 3 weeks after his death, and it is reported that he was found in an embrace with the mannequin replica of Eleanor. Further rumours circulated after his death that he somehow had Eleanor's body switched with the dummy, and Eleanor had been returned to him. But there is no evidence to back this up, and it is highly unlikely. An article written in 1982 tells of how renovation workers found a note allegedly written by Carl Tanzler, confessing to having killed Eleanor by poisoning her in order to carry out his destiny. The note read, "She died because I gave this to her mercifully. I mixed the root of wolfsbane with aconite diluted. It was palatable, and my loved one departed this miserable world on October the 25th, 1931. Suffer no more, sweet Eleanor. I have sent you to the angels with my golden elixir."